Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Horned Goddesses in History, a challenge to tradition, question mark, which I've forgotten to type. As Sam mentioned, I am Anna Milon. My PhD at the University of Exeter was on the Horned God, a modern pagan deity and literary figure, and on his role as a figurehead of environmental awareness and as a kind of embodiment of wild nature. And over the course of exploring this figure, I also looked at other related entities, and that, of course, included horned and antlered goddesses. But this talk isn't just an extension of that research, but it was also prompted by a Medium article that I read that ticked me off so much, I decided to write a whole talk about it. And this talk, first of all, harshly criticizes the antlered goddess that is probably going to be most familiar to people who know anything about antlered goddesses, and that is Ellen of the Ways. And the author, Derek James Healy, found a myth that found that Ellen did not have enough archaeological and academic evidence to substantiate her as a modern pagan deity. And he wrote, among other things that we will get into in more detail, that just because we have a hunch doesn't mean we just take theory for theory's sake. You need peer-reviewed proof and evidence. And my gut response to that was, well, do you? Do you always need peer-reviewed proof and evidence? And is that always the type of information that you should go with? I feel that Healy's article kind of exposed something about the pursuit of capital T truth and our very reasonable desire to want to have meaningful, clear answers. And unfortunately, the setback there is that academia and academic inquiry very rarely offers us those clear-cut answers that don't come with caveats, that cannot be overturned as new evidence emerges, and that allow for a simple statement without a whole narrative that makes it quite opaque and complex. So let's get into it. Who is Ellen of the Ways? Ellen of the Ways is an antlered goddess that shares her kind of symbolic setting with the horned god and the green man, much more widely known and recognizable figures. She is mostly written about by Caroline Wise and is best known in terms of images in the visionary art of Cheska Potter. So both women start writing about her around the beginning of 1980s. 1983 is a date that is often cited. And Caroline Wise kind of expands on Ellen's imagery and makes her quite an expansive, a broad-reaching figure. She is the Green Lady, the British Venus, the Flower Bride. So she's reaching for the imagery of Blodeuwedd in the Mabinogion. She is the horned goddess and a companion to both the Green Man and Herne the Hunter. But she's also a figure of the lost shamanism of the Isles of Britain. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to it, that we can allegedly follow across Scandinavia, Russia, Mongolia, Siberia, India, and beyond. So she is both recognizable to us as a companion or a mirror of the horned god. And she's associated with land sovereignty, with migratory pathways of deer, but also with spirit flight and shamanic dreaming and prophetic dreaming. So she's an incredibly kind of wide-reaching figure in that sense. What I think Caroline Wise was attempting to do in choosing the frame of shamanism and animism to talk about Ellen is to find a framework to explain experiences that she herself was having. These are often referred to as UPGs, or unverified personal gnosis, and can include anything from visions, dreams, kind of serendipitous experiences, things that amount to personal knowledge and personal revelation without being underpinned by existing written text or an existing community teaching in an obvious way. And Wise is very transparent that this is what she's trying to do. For example, she writes in an interview with John Collins, through various vision quests, I was shown that the migratory paths of the reindeer were the first trackways walked for millennia by the beasts alone, and then followed by humans. And it is that route, those roots, that kind of concept of migration that Ellen embodies and protects as a supernatural being. And in her most recent publication on the goddess, Finding Ellen, published in 2015, Wise again adds that there was nothing in our own culture, she felt, to show us what these experiences were. There were no shamanic roots to draw on. Wise notes that from the get-go, she met quite a lot of pushback, both from modern Wiccans who felt that there couldn't be an antlered goddess because the horned god was already right there, and felt that they didn't want a kind of a different figure to interact with, and from people who felt that, again, there wasn't enough of a kind of cohesive body of written work to underpin Ellen and to make her, to them, feel legitimate. Luckily, Wise found a receptive companion in Cheska Potter, who also described having visions of, in this case, an immense goddess figure dressed in green and gold over the church of St. Pancras. And this is Old St. Pancras Church, which is just behind St. Pancras International train station in London. And it is a wonderful place to visit. I highly recommend it, not only for this association with Ellen of the Ways and Cheska Potter, but also because of it being the burial place of Mary Wollstonecraft and the location of the famous Hardy tree. So lots of ticks for the Gothic lovers out there. But Caroline Wise and Cheska Potter have collaborated at length, and over the years have attracted a small but focused community of people interested in exploring Ellen and writing about her. And here are some of the publications by the likes of John Matthews, John Collins, Caitlin Matthews, Ellen Sentian, Yuri Leach, although that list is by no means exhaustive. Just as the figure has attracted her own champions, she has also attracted a degree of criticism, most notable of which is this article by Derek James Healy, initially published in 2021, but updated several times up until 2024. So definitely an article that attracted a lot of scrutiny and conversation. And Healy begins by acknowledging the kind of fraught nature of a white British woman engaging with indigenous tradition, especially with shamanism. He uses this quote that seems to equate the Native American figure of the Deer Woman or the Deer Lady with Ellen of the Ways. Personally, I'm not sure that any of the kind of core authors dealing with Ellen actually do that, but I appreciate, because there is a narrative, that Ellen is not so much a goddess of deer who is called Ellen, but rather that Ellen itself is an ancient word for deer, so she is a deer goddess first and foremost, that equation can be made. So Healy rightly acknowledges the problematic history of this phrase highlighted on the screen, that she leads us to the lost shamanism of the British Isles. Now, there is no written record for any kind of shamanic or animistic tradition in the British Isles. We can surmise that there may have been one, but it is impossible to recover in a generic kind of archaeological sense. And of course, it would be very damaging to transplant a First Nations or an Indigenous spirituality into British soil and claim that there is some similarity by virtue of kind of systemic similarities. And in terms of that, I really recommend the work of Anna Fisk, who talks about own narratives, talks about the borrowing of Indigenous figures and narratives and structures by modern pagans, and what potential kind of burden that carries and how those conversations can be had. And it comes from this wonderful book published, edited by Catherine Roundtree, called Cosmopolitanism, Nationalism, and Modern Paganism. Well worth a read. But unfortunately, while Healy begins with this worthwhile topic, his article very quickly devolves into an ad hominem attack against Caroline Wise and her supporters, whom he accuses of being wholesale inventors of a fictitious goddess that they propagate for financial gain, and that they effectively run what he calls a cult to, I guess, delude people and trick them out of their money. It's not entirely clear what their core pursuit is. And in his criticism of Ellen of the Ways, Healy calls for this peer-reviewed proof and evidence as the basis of the type of deigenesis, or the creation of a deity, that resulted in Ellen. And conversely, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that peer-reviewed evidence is not necessary in sacred histories, and even the presence of such proof does little to legitimize or dismiss a hypothetical deity. So this is at the core of the matter. First of all, Caroline Wise and her collaborators like John Matthews are very clear in their publications that they are not writing works of history or academic works, that they are interested in their personal experiences and they want to share those experiences with a wider public. And they are writing works of esoterica with all of the kind of caveats and pitfalls that may imply. Secondly, Healy seems to be laboring under the expectation that peer-reviewed proof and evidence will yield a linear, clear story to whether Ellen is an existing historical figure or not. And one of the examples he gives is that of Herne the Hunter. And he claims, well, he writes that Herne the Hunter was invented by Margaret Murray. And that is just an incredibly reductive way of presenting that particular piece of information, regardless which side of the equation you fall on. For instance, the earliest written survival of Herne the Hunter's name available to us today comes from William Shakespeare's comedy, The Merry Wives of Windsor, published at the turn of the 17th century. There, Herne himself doesn't appear on stage, but instead acts as disguise to the failed lover John Falstaff. Herne is described as your typical Elizabethan vengeful ghost. He was once a keeper in Windsor Great Park. He took his own life by hanging himself off from an oak tree, and since his spirit is unable to rest, but rattles the chains that he is bound with, destroys trees, and makes cattle yield blood instead of milk. He is described as antlered, but that is likely a visual gag for the Elizabethan audience, who, seeing Falstaff with these big branching antlers that he adopted as a disguise, to disguise himself as Herne, would have recognized him as a cuckold and a failed lover, which is exactly what he is in the narrative. But the image of Herne the Hunter that Murray engages with isn't actually the one discussed in Shakespeare. Instead, the name of the Shakespearean character is borrowed by Victorian novelist W.H. Ainsworth for a cameo character in his historical novel Windsor Castle, published in 1842. There, Herne is given the backstory that most of us will probably be familiar with today, that he was a groundskeeper and a forester in the reign of Richard II, that he saved the king's life during a hunting sortie, but was mortally wounded himself, that he was saved by a dark, mysterious man in black called Urswick, but the jealous fellow jealous foresters, jealous of Hearn's hunting skill, conspired with Urswick to allow him to recover, but to rob him of his ability to track game. Hearn then does recover, but is unable to track for the king, and depressed over the loss of his livelihood and his identity and his disgrace, decides to kill himself by hanging himself off an oak tree. He is then mysteriously revived by Urswick and is said to ride at the head of a wild hunt, a supernatural hunting party that is staffed by the very foresters that conspired and were instrumental in his demise. Finally, King Richard confronts Hearn and asks him to stop his nightly ridings, to which request Hearn acquiesces if the foresters that conspired against him are put to death, which they are, and the hauntings stop, with the one caveat that Hearn returns on the eve of some calamity for Britain, or if the royal family is in peril. So that's the story that Harrison Ainsworth weaves. And that is the story that Margaret Murray then quotes in her The God of the Witches, the second monograph in her seminal three-partite witch cult hypothesis, which holds, I'm sure you are familiar, that individuals accused of witchcraft in the early modern period were the practitioners of a version, a survival of a prehistoric fertility cult with a horned or antlered male deity as its chief worshipped figure. So Murray engages with a fictional text for her discussion of one of the manifestations of an antlered male supernatural principle. It doesn't really amount to whether she makes him up or not. Furthermore, we cannot be wholly sure whether Shakespeare, in his own engagement with Hearn, is making him up wholesale or is drawing on a pre-existing folkloric tradition. Simon Young seems to sway in the way of that there was an existing folklore tradition that just hasn't survived to us today. And Jeremy Hart, on the other hand, suggests that no, this probably was an invention in Shakespeare's time, if not by Shakespeare himself. Regardless of Shakespeare's own sources, Hearn does actually enter oral narrative post factum. In fact, after Ainsworth's novel, which is immensely popular in the time. In fact, during his life, Ainsworth outsold Dickens, and yet he is virtually unknown today, I would say. And notable folklorists like Catherine Briggs, Christina Hall, and Ruth L. Tongue all record oral narratives of encounters with Hearn, or hearing the sounds of his horn, or being chased down by his horse. So Hearn does become a folkloric character in his own right. So even if that transformation happens in more recent history, he still cannot be claimed to be wholly made up or wholly fictional. And so there isn't this single undisputed narrative thread. New evidence may come to light that will lead us to reassess what we're currently talking about, what we're currently saying about Hearn, what we currently know about him. But to speak of evidence, let's humor Healy for a moment and go and find some proof as to antlered goddess figures in history. One of the archaeological finds that is most often discussed in association with Ellen, but also other antlered goddesses like Canuna and Carvonia, is this little bronze figurine currently housed in the British Museum. And on the surface, what we know about her is pretty much what is written on the slide. She is a bronze figure of a seated goddess with antlers on her head, holding a cornucopia, or a horn of plenty, and a patera, which is a votive dish. She's about 2.5 inches tall. She was created in the Gallo-Roman period, so in Gaul, what is now modern-day France, under Roman occupation, between the 1st and 3rd century of current era. She was excavated in the village of Breuil-les-Pezem in the Franche-Comté region near Besançon, in the kind of east of France. It's quite close to Geneva to Switzerland. And she's made of bronze, and she is this lovely little entity. Here is what she looks like in situ. You can go and see her in the British Museum. She's in room 69. And the explanation card attached to her is, I would say, incredibly spare. It just says, antlered gods are known from the Celtic areas of the Roman Empire. They appear to be connected with darkness and death. This figure may be such a deity in her own right, or may be a consort of one of the male gods. So this is the British Museum, a research and conservation organization with an incredibly rich amount of sources at their disposal, who are generously financed, who have all of this capacity to conduct extensive research and to speak about the finds in their collections with some weight and authority. And even so, they are incredibly hesitant about saying anything definitive about this deity. For instance, in their description of antlered gods associated with darkness and death, they gesture towards Cernunnos, who is probably the best known Gallo-Roman antlered male deity. He's associated most readily with the Gundestrup cauldron, for example, found in Denmark, but also appears on about 20-ish stone and bronze images excavated across Western Europe. And even so, they choose not to name him. They choose not to make that connection too overt. Secondly, they are hesitant around identifying this goddess or this figure in particular, saying that she might be a female version of Cernunnos or she might be a consort. Of course, they are here kind of acknowledging the debate that continues as to whether Cernunnos can be considered a single figure or whether antlered, cross-legged male figures holding variously torques, bags of grain or coins or ram-headed serpents are in fact a single figure or multiple supernatural entities that are just responsible for the same domain and so have symbols in common, because that is still a conversation that can be had today. So again, British Museum, vast resources, great authority, and they are very hesitant. They do not provide a single unequivocal narrative about this figure. But can we find out more about where she comes from? Having had a look, the first thing I found was that she was a subject of discussion far before a first kind of initial writing about Ellen of the Ways by Wise, Potter, and their associates. So James Healy's statement that there were no antlered goddesses and no desire for such before the 1980s is proven incorrect in this instance. She is discussed as an archaeological find by Flinders Petrie, the famous archaeologist, and Harold Peake, his colleague and notable antiquarian and archaeologist as well. And both of them make this or attempt to make this link across historical periods and cultural domains between prehistoric images and, on the one hand, archaeological finds or even in some cases living practices in northeastern Europe and into Russia, and on the other hand, in the classical world, they're trying to see similarities to kind of draw these seemingly disparate elements together. They're kind of very Fraserian in that sense. They're trying to find a system that underpins all beliefs across Europe and into Western Asia. And their debate can be summarized as follows: that this prehistoric carving on the left, the Venus of Lausel, depicting a woman holding what they interpret as a drinking horn, is an iteration of the same figure or divine principle as Cernunnos's female companion that appears on some stone reliefs in modern-day France. And here she is on the right, holding a cornucopia and potentially a bag in her other hand. It's not entirely clear. And that this relationship is similar to that between the Sorcerer of Trois Frères, a Magdalenian cave image that is the earliest image associated with the horned god and Cernunnos. And here he is on the Pillar of the Boatman, discovered in Paris in 1711. And so they are trying to kind of systematize this relationship. So, of course, already as early as the start of the 20th century, she's associated with the horned god. Now, what is very interesting here is that if you look at the dates, Flinders Petrie publishes his article in 1917, with peaks following in 1922. Margaret Murray's first publication on the horned god comes from 1929, and it appears in the BBC Listener magazine. It kind of prefaces her monograph, which comes out several years later. And whereas before it was tempting to say that Murray followed the trend in only writing about a male horned god as sitting at the head of her kind of the possible fertility cult that she discusses. Now, considering that Flinders Petrie was her academic advisor and hugely influential on her work, and she would have known Harold Peake and would have followed his debates and his conversations, it is much more likely that she knew about the female antlered goddess and made a choice not to include her. Now, the reasons for that choice are up for debate, but it reframes Murray's work as not just a reflection of the de facto narrative of the day, but a much more constructed piece of writing and a piece of rhetoric. Looking back to how the figurine arrived in the British Museum, she was purchased in 1856 from Charles Roach Smith alongside the entire collection of the Museum of London Antiquities. Charles Roach Smith is a terribly overlooked Victorian archaeologist and antiquarian who championed the importance of archaeology outside the classical world. So ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt, which were given pride of place at the time. And he excavated extensively in the British Isles and in France, and even created a what started as a private collection and then evolved into the Museum of London Antiquities, which meant to showcase the best archaeological finds from London, a lot of them recovered from the River Thames. Eventually, he sold the collection of that museum in its entirety to the British Museum, alongside several additional items, which included our little figurines. There she is on the flyleaf of the catalogue. So the Museum of London Antiquities had 8 volumes of a printed catalogue, and which accompanies the sale. And one of them has this additional page that lists all of the extra bits that were thrown in to presumably sweeten the deal. And she is described, as you would expect, statuette, female divinity, seated cross-legged, draped, horns on head, patera in right hand, cornucopia in left, height 2.5 inches. No history. That is interesting, because Roach Smith was famous for championing good evidence and for being obsessive in his cataloging. Not only did he produce multiple catalogues of finds that he came into contact with, but he also was a prolific diarist, recording items given to him as gifts or interesting things he saw in other collections. I've gone looking in his diaries, and he just does not mention her at all. He lists a lot of the gifts quite specifically, but there is nothing that is ambiguous or that comes close to as complex a figurine as this. The only likely similar kind of entity that I was able to find in his catalogues come from this edition of Collectanea Antiqua from 1848. It's the little seated figure on the left. She is again holding a cornucopia and a drinking vessel, a cup of some sort, and she's sitting in a wicker chair, whereas our kind of goddess is seating either cross-legged or on some kind of foldable stool. And this is Abundantia, or Dame Abundance. She is a Gallo-Roman entity associated with the fertility of the land, with fecundity, but also with the human produce in a domestic sense more generally. So in that sense, you can draw some parallels between her domain and that of Cernunnos, who is often depicted surrounded by both wild and domestic animals, and who is associated with chthonic forces and with the wealth of the ground, anything that is underground, from precious metals to spirits of the dead to the germinating seeds. And again, he doesn't make the distinction between wild and domestic, and is able to kind of be a patron to both those realms. Okay, you can make a case. Well, this is a similar figure from the collection of the guy who has the antlered goddess initially, so maybe we should just go with Abundantia. But then again, if you look at other, again, academic sources, many of them peer-reviewed catalogs, you see no consensus in her identification. She is linked to Cernunnos as either a female version or his consort by Reina at the start of the 20th century and by Frei Bobber in 1954. Helen Walters writes of her as a goddess whose sphere of influence may have been similar to that of Cernunnos, but does not follow that up with a link equating the two in 76. She's identified as Fortuna by Boucher in 76, Abundantia again by Enright in 96, and by one of the matres. This is a group of usually 3 women who were seen as the spiritual nourishers of soldiers on campaign. She equally can be a Gallic goddess whose name does not survive to us, as hypothesized by Lerat in 64, or even the Egyptian goddess Isis, though that last identification is widely accepted as erroneous. It also comes from one of the first catalogues that mentions her, Montfaucon, in 1719. So it's interesting. She's been around for a long time. If we do follow the kind of Abundantia Fortuna line, I've thrown the Rosmerta into there as well. Rosmerta is a Gallo-Roman goddess who seems to share her functions with Fortuna. Rosmerta specifically is also associated with Mercury, the god of commerce. Here they are as a couple on the right. She is holding a cornucopia and may have been holding a patera in her right hand, and he is definitely holding a patera in his right hand. The reason I hone in on the Rosmerta and Mercury pair is because when Rosmerta is depicted on her own, she sometimes borrows aspects of Mercury. So here she is depicted on the left holding a caduceus, and on the right with his little winglets. So it seems that if depicted alone, Rosmerta, who is Mercury's companion, is able to kind of gesture to him, or maybe to represent his power by having his attributes. So if we follow this logic, we could argue that our antlered goddess may have been a companion to Cernunnos. Cernunnos is depicted with a companion, such as this image on the left here, where in fact he gets 2, the clearly female one in a kind of draped garment, holding a patera and a cornucopia. Unfortunately, her head is severely damaged, so we don't know what happened there. And a hermaphroditic figure in the middle, which I meant to look into and I'm really struggling to find anything about why this grouping might, what those 3 figures are doing. But kind of back to the female companion. We know that there is a female companion, although we know virtually nothing about her. But if Rosmerta as Mercury's companion is able to share his attributes, perhaps this Rosmerta-like being as Cernunnos' companion may also borrow his. And when depicted alone, perhaps she can be depicted with antlers in a kind of deference to Cernunnos being her partner, or kind of associated with her. Digging further back, this screenshot comes from Stephanie Boucher's work from 1976, and The footnote gave me pause because at the bottom, she's identified in the expected way as the fortune from the British Museum, but at the top, the same image is footnoted as the fortune of Besançon. Disparu, missing. What's going on there? Looking further back, Boucher cites Salomon Reinard's 1904 catalogue of Gallic statuary, which, if you trawl through all of the 6 volumes, many of which are broken into 2 parts of them, you will find that he actually mentions our goddess twice. He doesn't seem to have realized this. But on the right, we've got the British Museum figurine identified as expected. She's associated with Cernunnos. She's identified as his companion, Parèdre. And on the left, you see a drawing this time of what is fairly reasonably assumed to be the same figure, who's associated as a female version of Cernunnos from Besançon, missing again, disparu. The image on the left, Reinard borrows from this 1719 catalogue by Bernard de Montfaucon, L'Antiquité expliquée et représentée en figure. Montfaucon is the one who misidentifies this figurine as Isis because he looks at the antlers on her head and goes, these are not antlers, these are palm leaves. How he gets there, I'm not entirely sure, but he groups her with other representations of Isis on this page. Now, we are fairly sure that these are definitely antlers because she is not the only antlered goddess that we know of. There is a comparable, again, small bronze figurine held at Clermont-Ferrand, which is just south of Vichy in France, which depicts a much more severely weathered figure, but who's also clearly antlered, is holding the stub of a cornucopia in her left hand and could have been holding something in her right as well. Going back further, I stumbled across the work of Lucien Lerat, who was a lecturer and archaeologist who lived and dedicated his entire career to Besançon, where, of course, the kind of missing figurine is said to be from. And reading a review of his book, Besançon Antique, I've noticed this line that he writes about Dies indigène Aramur de Cerf, an indigenous goddess. I mean, basically just means a pre-Roman goddess with the antlers of a stag. And I thought, gotcha, he's discussing her. He's going to tell me where she comes from. He doesn't. He just goes, this is a thing that exists. We dug it up somewhere. Or he didn't dig it up, but this was excavated close to Besançon. Good luck identifying what it is. It is finally his student, Helen Walter, that provides the crucial clue. Walter traces back the catalogues of the Besançon Jesuit college, where the figure is first recorded as being housed. And she discovers that the figure was excavated at some point in or before 1699 in the little village of Breuil-les-Pezem, near the church of St. Peter and St. Paul. And that she was transferred to the Jesuit College's Cabinet of Curiosities and was held there until sometime in 1764. So in 1765, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, are suppressed in France, and their goods are confiscated, and the college in Besançon is closed down. An inventory was compiled between the 1st and the 12th of February 1765, after which the college was sealed. The inventory does not mention any antiques beyond 9 small purses of medals or coins of bronze and other metals locked in an old armoire. Now, this struck the people who wrote the inventory as irregular. And so they approached the Jesuit brothers who were there and asked where the rest of it has gone. And the brothers explained that upon hearing that their college was to be disbanded, they, of course, tried to provide support and transport and lodgings to the community that was in their care. And also, the previous September, they had to purchase a whole 1,000 livres worth of wine, and they had to rustle the money up somehow. So it is very likely that our figurine was either sold at that point, pocketed by someone, stolen, or vanished into the thin air in some other similar way. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to fill this gap between 1765 and 1856 when she turns up in the sale between Charles Roach Smith and the British Museum. But perhaps Smith's treatment of her can be indicative of what is going on here. Because if a man who is quite obsessive about documenting his finds chooses to withhold the history of this figure, perhaps he knows that she came by not quite honest means. Perhaps he's protecting not necessarily his own reputation, but the reputation of the individual who gave or sold the figurine to him. Perhaps in time there will be more evidence that will allow us to close this gap. But just to finish off, I would like to finish on this quote from Ronald Hutton, which I think summarizes wonderfully the disconnect between the archaeological kind of find, its facts and the history, and Ellen of the Ways, who we started with. Hutton writes, the creation, discovery, development, or contacting of apparently new forms of non-Christian superhuman beings did not cease with the coming of modernity. Now, with the figurine being excavated at some point before 1699, we cannot reasonably establish the archaeological context in which she was deposited. That was not recorded and is now lost. What the makers would have called her, how they would have interacted with her, or what kind of meaning they would have ascribed to her. That origin for her is inaccessible to us. But we can still encounter the artifact as it is. We can still go and look at the goddess in the British Museum and form some kind of relationship or attachment to her today. And that is no less meaningful for being detached from her initial history, which is unknown to us anyway. And that is in no way undercut by peer-reviewed evidence or academic study, which doesn't provide us with a single answer anyway. And so I hope that this can be kind of a step towards recognizing that unverified personal gnosis and personal revelation and scholastic inquiry are two different systems of understanding and encountering the world that are not in competition and that cannot be equated to one another, but can coexist. And I will close there. Thank you very much.